Good afternoon. We're gathered to celebrate the life of our friend, teacher, and colleague, Neale Reinitz, to share memories with each other and with his family, and if in the midst of laughter we need it, to provide comfort to one another. Neale's was a long and active life, enriched by lively discussion, sometimes contentious argument, and lots of laughter. He delighted in sharing his knowledge, deep and broad. He delighted in having lively students and in finding new insights to amuse and amaze. And above all, he delighted to find silliness in the midst of pomposity. Neale wrote out some plans for a service like this, preferences, prohibitions, readings. The Marxist prelude was essential, and we have done it. The poetry is assigned, and it is in your program. Comments from students and colleagues were to be kept short, and he allowed as how it might be okay if Pickle presided. Neale knew he would die. Each of his selections reflect on our mortality, the varied perspectives on the common theme and expectation are among his gifts to us. There will be no test at the end of this service. We will begin with the first comment.
Today I'm reading a tribute from Ken Sims, who couldn't be here today because he's in Antarctica collecting various samples from volcanoes he's studying. This morning, however, he took a helicopter ride around one of those volcanoes, Mount Terror on Ross Island, specifically in Neale's memory, and he sent the following. Neale Reinitz. I cannot reminisce of Neale without conjuring up memories of the whole Reinitz family, Neale, Bev, and John. My memories of the Reinitz family started when I met John in the Chicago basin of the San Juan Mountains. John and I instantly found a kinship, and thereafter I would often go over and hang out with him in the Reinitz household. I know John will not like this comparison, but the best metaphor I can think of for the Reinitz household is some idealistic, cheesy TV show like Father Knows Best. But there was also a critical difference. The Reinitzes were the quintessential academic version of such familial perfectionism. To give you a sense of what it was like for me to know the Reinitz family. At the Reinitzes, you would enter the house to be greeted by two memorable, distinct, affectionate cats that I learned to love, despite my dislike of cats. It was a misguided dislike brought on by my allergies, but forever set straight by Sylvester the cat. We would always hang out in John's room as he enthusiastically explained some seemingly unfathomable physical construct to his group of admiring friends. His explanations of black holes, subatomic particles, and so on inspired awe and wonder, and were always coherent and amazingly comprehensible, but most often impossible to re-explain later. When venturing downstairs, Bev would be making dinner, having just come back from some civic volunteer effort. Neale would be mixing a cocktail, explaining the origin, historical significance, and proper way to make said drink. Being invited to stay for dinner was always special. First of all, Bev was a fantastic cook, so the food was always amazing. But then, unlike any other household I had ever been to, dinner almost always included a friendly debate, just for simple intellectual pursuit. Politics, history, you name it. Those debates were educational, inspirational, and always fun. While the Reinitz household was filled with intellectual stimulation and academic fervor, it also had a peaceful, comfortable ambiance like I had never before experienced. I loved going over to the Reinitzes and found great solace in just being there. Neale and Bev took me in during my last year of high school when I needed a place to live. Their positive influence was transformative and persists. I will forever be indebted to them for all the love they shared with me that year and throughout their lives. With regard to Neale specifically, what an intellectual and loving man he was. I have so many fond memories of him. I remember learning how to make black and tans and learning the difference between good and bad scotch. I remember our adventures, rock climbing in a level mile canyon, Crestone Needle, North Maroon Bell when he arrested his near-death fall just at the last essential moment. I remember the inspiration he created in me for learning and wanting to aspire to more than just climbing. I remember the many books he gave me that I would never have read otherwise. But more than anything, I remember the love he had for his family. What a great man he was, and what a legacy he and Bev have left behind in their son, John. Thank you, Neale. Thank you, Bev. And thank you, John.
When I had Neale as a professor, my name was Sally Lenz, and it is a privilege to be here on this day. It is an unforgettable goodness to have someone believe in you. Such was Dr. Reinitz in my life. From his professional authority, he opened doors to opportunities that changed me profoundly. And he never asked for thanks. And so I say thanks on this day. Dr. Reinitz was my advisor. His job was to check his course schedule and against mine, but he did much more than that. Dr. Reinitz listened to my life. As a selected student and Becher Scholar, I was granted honors I didn't feel I deserved. You see, my father had lost his job the year I entered CC. And without a Becher Scholarship, I never could have come to this place. I knew it was the Becher that brought me here, but it was Dr. Reinitz who kept me here. It was Dr. Reinitz who believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. He taught the great literature of the Romantics, Wordsworth, Tennyson, Shelley, and Keats. And for some reason, I still don't know why, but one day he allowed me to teach the mythology of William Blake. After hours and hours of parsing this mystic poet's work together, I offered a lecture. And it was, in a way, one that someone else could have done, because what Blake did with his poetry was to try to create a way to counter the Industrial Revolution of England. Throughout my 3 years at Colorado College, Neale continued to advise me, but it was always with compassionate respect. When he said, "Don't graduate early," I knew better. But Neale worked with me. When I did finish my studies, I only had a modest future in mind, to teach English in junior high. And that's what I did for 1 year, until Dr. Reinitz nominated me for Woodrow Wilson. He saw something in me as a graduate student that I didn't see in myself. And that opened the door. Following those years, Dr. Reinitz was a Christmas card correspondent. I told him about finishing at Rutgers, about teaching at Brooklyn College, about teaching at the University of New Hampshire, and other events in my life. And thankfully, he never changed his address. So I could always mail my Christmas letter to 1928 North Nevada, and he would receive it. In the summer of 1973, I got a strange call in my home in Durham, New Hampshire. It was Dr. Reinitz, and he said, "Sally, how would you like to teach for 2 years at CC?" And I said, "What are you talking about? I don't think I can do that." And I hung up. I was stunned. But then a friend said, call Dr. Reinitz back and tell him you can do it. So I did. I came out for an interview, and I taught taking Joe Gordon's place for 2 years. And thank you, Neale, for giving me that chance to turn my life around, because I am a woman of the West, and I was never comfortable at the University of New Hampshire. So I spent 2 years, 1973 through 76, here with professors that then I could call friend, like Kenneth Burton and Doug Freed and Neale Reinitz. It is no small matter that Neale prepared for this day. He chose a poem as significant as his values. He chose a timeless message to mark the passage of time. Ode on a Grecian Urn is about something more than beauty. It's about what do we hold on to in a world of constant change. But if I could choose a poem for Neale and what he meant to me as a student, remembering all he did over 50 years of my life, I would choose a different romantic poem, one of William Wordsworth's. In a sonnet, Wordsworth looked at the stream and its flow, and he said these words: "For backward Dutton, as I cast my eyes, I see what was and is and will abide. Still glides the stream and shall forever glide. The form remains, the function never dies, while we, the brave, the mighty, and the wise, must vanish. Enough. If something from our hands has power to live and act and serve the future hour." Thank you, dear friend, for teaching us more than the romantic poets could say.
First, I'm going to read a statement, a beautiful statement from Jim Heckman. Jim was one of probably Neale's closest student friend over many years. He is in Vienna right now and couldn't come. He's a professor of economics at the University of Chicago, and you might know that he won the Nobel Prize in economics a little while ago. Here is his statement. It's with great sorrow that we mark the passing of Neale Reinitz. I deeply regret that I cannot be with you today to commemorate and celebrate his life and his influence. I had the great privilege of knowing and interacting with Neale over the past 51 years. I first encountered him along with Bill Hochman and Tom Ross in the Selected Students program at Colorado College in 1961-63. The Selected Student program was a 2-year sequence offered to academically motivated freshmen. The nominal goal of the program was to teach literature and history, but its real goal was to expose participants to the really big questions of Western thought. The sequence was more than just a structured course, although it was that. It became a way of life that absorbed all of us into the world of learning and excitement about ideas that we had never previously experienced. There was intense camaraderie among the students and the faculty. There were challenging readings and wonderfully stimulating exchanges that engaged us all, students, teachers, night and day. I've had few experiences in my life that were so transformative. The readings and exchanges in that sequence shaped my thinking. Every day, I draw on the lessons taught there, and I revisit the issues and dilemmas I first carefully examined there, not out of nostalgia, but out of their profound relevance for understanding and interpreting the world. We all learned that the unexamined life was not worth living, and we examined all we could. And central to the success of this sequence was Neale Reinitz, a brusque, exacting, but intrinsically genial man who demanded the best from us in our thinking and our writing. He introduced us to the canon of Western literature. His commentary greatly supplemented each lecture and each reading. We learned from him in the classroom, at parties, and in random encounters on the campus. He had an encyclopedic knowledge of many things, and he directed us to new worlds of ideas and literature. For this, I am deeply grateful. Neale had a well-developed sense of irony and a love of satire. These strands were wonderfully joined in his engaging discussion of Gulliver's Travels. He loved to talk about the mildly scatological Houyhnhnms, and he used Swift's presentation of this as a simulacrum for exposing the foibles of contemporary society. He thrived on the ironies in the different perspectives in that book. He flirted with what were to innocent Colorado College freshmen of the early 1960s risque themes, and they were always developed in a serious scholarly fashion. For example, when we studied the metaphysical poets, we read T.S. Eliot's famous essay on them. But we also paused over the titillating texts of the poems themselves and their suggestive themes. One of his favorite poems that became one of my favorites was Marvell's To His Coy Mistress, and he sent it to me to read to you now. Here it is. Had we both whirled enough in time, this coyness lady were no crime. We would sit down and think which way to talk and pass our long love's day. Thou by the Indian Ganges side shouldst rubies find. I, by the tide of Humber, would complain. I would love you 10 years before the flood, and you should, if you please, refuse till the conversion of the Jews. My vegetable love should grow vaster than empires and more slow. 100 years should go to praise thine eyes and on thy forehead gaze. 200 to adore each breast, but 30,000 to the rest. An age at least to every part, and the last age should show your heart. For lady, you deserve this state, nor would I love at lower rate. But at my back, I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near. And yonder, all before us lie deserts of vast eternity. Thy beauty shall no more be found, nor in thy marble vault shall sound my echoing song. Then worms shall try that long-preserved virginity, and your quaint honor turn to dust and into ashes all my lust. The grave's a fine and private place, but none I think do there embrace. Now, therefore, while the youthful hue sits on thy skin like morning dew, and while thy willing soul transpires at every pore with instant fires, now let us sport while we may, and now, like amorous birds of prey, rather at one our time devour than languish in his slow chap power. Let us roll all our strength and all our sweetness up into one ball and tear our pleasures with rough strife. Thus, though we cannot make our sun stand still, yet we will make him run. Neale embellished this poem and many of his other favorites among the metaphysical poets, but his repertoire was much larger than this. Zola, Manzoni, Homer, Eliot, Mann, Joyce, Smollett, and many others, authors, all rolled off his tongue and engaged and instructed us. His enthusiasm was infectious, and we all learned to love and fear his classes. He could both warm our hearts and fill us with fear of revealing our ignorance. He left an indelible impression on me. His New York tinged voice was unique. Years after I finished Colorado College, and some years after previously seeing him, I was walking down a street in Chicago when suddenly, from behind a wall, I heard that voice. I rushed around the wall, and lo and behold, there was Neale, lecturing a group of CC students about Chicago architecture with his customary wit, passion, and humor. There was an only, and will be only, one Reinitzian voice, filled with such authority, wit, wisdom, and sardonic humor. I count myself very lucky to have known him and to have learned so much from him. His passion for life and learning did not make the sun stand still, but surely made him run. I mourn his passing and regret that time's winged chariot has finally outraced him. Well, now I have a short statement of my own, and I'm going to ask my wife, Nance, to come up and stand by me, perhaps to hold my hand. Can I do this? Neale Reinitz was my oldest friend. He came to Colorado College in 1953, a year and a half before I did. Frank Kretzky of the English department introduced us. I was in Frank's office in Hayes House on the corner of Kashla and Cascade, where Packard Hall now stands. And Frank and Neale were having a weighty discussion about two characters, Marilyn and Joe. And I racked my brain to think of who they might be. I thought of Jane Austen, of Dickens, of Victor Hugo, and others. And then I realized they were talking about Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio. And that was the beginning of our friendship. My wife Peggy and I spent many happy hours with Neale and Beverly, first in their apartment in a World War II temporary building, also located where Packard Hall now stands, and then in their house in Nevada. When we had a roof-raising party for our new house on the Mesa on a Friday night, Beverly and Neale went home on Sunday afternoon. Beverly and Neale were devoted Democrats, and I worked with Beverly on many Democratic Party enterprises. Beverly and Elaine Freed, who's sitting right there, were in charge of the McGovern headquarters in Colorado Springs in 1972. Beverly was president and a fierce crusader for the North End Neighborhood Association, and she once ran for county commissioner. She and Nance, where is Nance? Well, she and Nance were fierce opponents on the racquetball court, and Beverly once hit a ball so hard and followed through and gashed her head with her own racket. Those early years were the Renaissance days of Colorado College, the era of Louis Benezet and Lou Warner. And we were the young Turks then. We worked hard, we played hard. Jim Beam was our favorite drink. Some older faculty members derisively called us the cocktail set. Lou Warner used to use Neale and me as a kind of sounding board. He took us out to lunch periodically, where he launched a stream of consciousness monologue with frequent ellipses that made us have to concentrate hard to follow the rapidly shifting train of thought. And then after a long while, Lou would stop talking and await our reaction. And afterwards, Neale would say to me, "Let all that sink into the ground." And we did. Neale was a bit chubby when I first knew him, and then he became a fanatical mountain climber, jogger, and bike rider, which slimmed him down. He climbed all the 14,000-foot peaks in Colorado, all 54 of them. Our greatest academic collaboration was in the selected student program, which Jim Heckman just wrote about, and Sally Lenz, that's the name I remember, and also Peter Bonovich, who's sitting back there, were in that group. With Tom Ross of the English department and strong support from Frank Kretzky and Lou Warner, we chose the 25 top students from the incoming freshman class. And Neale and Tom divided them up for freshman English, and I taught the whole group Western civilization. They were all brighter than we were, at least brighter than I was. I used to say I taught them everything I knew every day. It was an exciting time. Neale introduced me to a great deal of poetry and literature, particularly the poetry and music of the First World War. And we used to read some of it to each other after dinners at his house or ours. We sometimes listened to the great English musical, Oh, What a Lovely War, or to jazz music of the past, particularly the songs of Billie Holiday. And we loved the recording of My Fair Lady, and we used to prance around to the Rain in Spain falls mainly on the plain. When students were startled by a perhaps risque assigned reading, Neale would reply, "Just compare it to your daily thoughts." Neale and I were always the last faculty members to leave the scene of senior sneak day, wonderful days of beer and song with the graduating seniors. After one of those joyous, sunlit days, we were coming down Ute Pass in my car, just behind Herman Snyder, then the college sculptor. Turning a corner, we came upon Herman's car, upside down. He was dead. That was the end of the last of the old-time senior sneak days. After Neale retired, and particularly after Beverly died, he and I had lunch almost every week, usually at Sheldon's Deli on North Nevada, where they called us boys. That's probably why we kept going back. We talked about films, politics, and books, about Russia, which Neale loved to visit, about the college and its people we had known. Recently, Neale liked to talk a lot about the war, which we shared. And I was so pleased to watch his warm, gentle friendship with Barbara, which gave him happiness in his last years. He was my oldest friend.
As mentioned in your program, I'm going to read John Keats's great ode. Well, there are many great odes. I'll be quoting from another one today, too. Ode on a Grecian Urn. Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time, sylvan historian, who canst thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than our rhyme? What leaf-fringed legend haunts about thy shape of deities or mortals or of both? In Tempe or the dales of Arcady, what men or gods are these? What maidens loaf? What mad pursuit? What struggle to escape? What pipes and timbrels? What wild ecstasy? Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Therefore, ye soft pipes, play on, not to the sensual ear, but more endeared, pipe to the spirit, ditties of no tone. Fair youth, beneath the trees thou canst not leave thy song, nor ever can these trees be bare. Bold lover, never canst thou kiss, though winning near the goal. Yet do not grieve, she cannot fade, though thou hast not thy bliss. Forever wilt thou love, and she be fair. Ah, happy, happy boughs, that cannot shed your leaves, nor ever bid the spring adieu. And happy melodist, unwearied, forever piping songs, forever new. More happy love, more happy, happy love, forever warm and still to be enjoyed, forever panting and forever young. All breathing human passion far above, that leave a heart high sorrowful and cloyed, a burning forehead and a parching tongue. Who were those coming to the sacrifice? To what green altar, O mysterious priest, leadst thou that heifer lowing at the skies? And all her silken flanks with garlands dressed. What little town by river or seashore or mountain built with peaceful citadel is emptied of this folk, this pious morn? And little town, thy streets forever more will silent be, and not a soul to tell why thou art desolate can e'er return. O Attic shape, fair attitude, with breed of marble men and maidens overwrought, with forest branches and the trodden weed, thou silent form dost tease us out of thought, as doth eternity. Cold pastoral, when old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other woe than ours, friend to man, to whom thou sayest, beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is all ye know on earth, and all ye need to know. Since my first year at Colorado College was also Neale's first year as chair of the English department, which began a long and distinguished career as chair. I believe it was 9 years. I thought that I would address those marvelous years this morning in a few brief remarks. I love the idea that Neale chose Ode on a Grecian Urn, because his mind was so richly engaged in his imagination with conflict, but also with the beauty that emerges from poetry and from art, its tumult and its silence, which seemed to me to inhere at the poem's center. This might never have happened, my being here tonight, or Neale might not have been here this afternoon either, if at the end of my first year at Colorado College, hiking in the mountains with Neale and Tom Mauck, we hadn't all been hit by lightning. It was an out-of-body experience, shall we say. I felt more like T.S. Eliot in the first book of Four Quartets when he writes, "In my beginning is my end," because I wasn't sure I was going to survive that trip. We went up in sunlight, it started to rain, it started to sleet, it started to hail, it started to snow, and then as the Emily Dickinson poem said, the lightning and thunder came in on moccasin feet, and we thought our number was up. Well, we survived it, and many glorious years were to follow. As I said, Freer and I first arrived at Colorado College in the fall of 1971. Neale had just been named chair of the English department. It's hard to imagine a better chair for a fledgling professor, something that I know Dan Tynan, a thought which I know Dan Tynan would share with me. Patient, helpful, friendly, with support and advice, always encouraging us to new thoughts, new courses, new books, new ways of approaching our teaching. Neale was a model of a chair. Department meetings were a tour de force with Neale, and they went almost as long as a Jerry Lewis telethon. They were marked, nevertheless, by a fairness and thoroughness that were exemplary. Neale had a probing mind, as we all know. He would take huge numbers of notes before he would come into a department meeting. He had a black felt pen, small pages, which would pile up beside him as he would conduct a department meeting. Those small notes amongst which he worked and took notes, all amidst coiling clouds of cigarillo smoke, as many of you may remember. You could pass by Neale's office some evenings, and he taught in the afternoon, and then he would work in his office in the evening, and you would see clouds of smoke rising inside the office. It always reminded me of Marlowe sitting on a boat waiting to go out into the ocean near the mouth of the Thames River, waiting for the fog to clear so he could make his journey outward. And that's, of course, what Neale did with great brilliance and great skill. What's most important about a chair? I think hiring people, hiring the best people. Neale was a virtuoso at that. While he was chair, we hired George Butte, Adrian Seward, such exceptional, extraordinary people, and they remain today among our very best. And of course, there's the spectacular Joan Stone, who arrived as a part-time teacher with us and turned out to be not only the best of poets, the best of teachers, and the best of friends. What an extraordinary person she was and is. These were wonderful years of growth and prosperity for the department. And I can lay the lion's share of gratitude at Neale's feet for this remarkable success. Neale was a marvelous teacher as well, as Sally Lenz mentioned earlier, and as Jim Heckman's remarks also indicate, with a flair for performance, mixed with a prodigious intellect and a genuine interest in his students. Sally mentioned the Johnson and Boswell course. Well, I remember the Restoration drama course, in which Neale would often don a wig, a long rope, and do a Groucho walk down the hallway toward class, looking not so much like Dr. Johnson, but more like mop-headed Harpo Marx, whom we just witnessed doing his thing in that great film, Horse Feathers. Neale was fantastic as a lecturer, brilliantly going over Boswell's life of Johnson and Johnson's lives of the poets. It was this striking incongruity that marked Neale's teaching, and I think to some extent his life. It was a delight to behold how he would mix the high and the low, the serious and the light, with that extraordinary sense of humor that he also possessed, that raucous sense of humor that Jim Heckman mentioned, mixed with a complete and complex seriousness about his scholarly and pedagogical pursuits, and an immense sensitivity to language, to feeling, to the arts themselves. All of this culminated in that late flowering of Neale's, when, after he had retired, he published 2 editions of fiction by Edmund Wilson, and then, unfortunately, posthumously, a biography of the great scholar from the University of Wisconsin, William Ellery Leonard. That should be published, John Reinitz tells me, in the next couple of months. But then there's Keats. There's always Keats with Neale Reinitz. He taught a Keats course at Colorado College for years. It was a celebrated course. Keats, the poet of great suffering and even greater joy, of dark despair and happy, happy love. Keats, dead so young, Neale, the aging man, loving Keats' bright star life more and more as he grew older. Neale was a complex man. None of us here can deny that. And I doubt any of us could get to the bottom of him, nor should we try. Best to enjoy the incongruities. While I began my remarks with Keats' urn, permit me to end with words of the last of the great Keatsian odes, Ode to Autumn. For Neale, and for this dying season, this coming winter, this approaching spring, this celebration of summer, is all brought to the fore in this marvelous poem. I'd like to read to you from its last stanza. Where are the songs of spring? Aye, where are they? Think not of them. Thou, autumn, hast thy music too, while barred clouds bloom the soft dying day and touch the stubble plains with rosy hue. Then in a wailful choir the small gnats mourn among the river sallows, borne aloft or sinking as the light wind lives or dies. As full-grown lambs loud bleat from hilly bourne, hedge crickets sing, and now with treble soft the redbreast whistles from a garden croft, and gathering swallows twitter in the skies.
It was Neale's wish that I read poetry by Anna Akhmatova at his memorial. I chose 2 short poems, Leningrad in March of 1941 and Courage. These poems speak to 3 themes which mattered to Neale and which he and I talked about again and again: the city of St. Petersburg, the Russian language and literature, and World War II. And now I still find that Neale's voice continues to engage me on the same topics. During the 19 years of our friendship, Neale embodied for me a true cosmopolitan. While he was one of the most patriotic Americans I know, he loved Colorado, the mountains, and he felt at home in New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. He also loved being in Russia, and he felt special connection to St. Petersburg. Neale and I spent many hours walking this fantastic, majestic city, breathing its humid, often cold air, losing our bearings in the endless, dizzying halls of the Hermitage, navigating our way along the granite embankments of Moika to the Café Idiot, where we ate borscht, drank Bloody Marys, and played chess. Neale often went exploring the city and its outskirts on his own. Armed with a backpack and a map, he would leave in the morning and return late in the evening. His attachment to the city was much more than a tourist enthusiasm for a fascinating new place. In addition to Neale's mother's family, who came from Russia, I believe that what Neale found in St. Petersburg was what inspired and defined his own interior: the celebration of the arts, steadfastness in the face of calamity, a sense of history, a sense of humor and courage. I will read each of the two poems by Anna Akhmatova, first in the English translation and then in the original. Leningrad in March 1941. Cadran Soler on the Menshikoff's house, raising a wave, a steamship is passing. Oh, is there anything in the world more familiar to me than the shine of these spires and the gleam of these waters? The side streets a black slit, sparrows sit along the wires. On these excursions learned by heart a salty tang, just right. Ленинград в марте 1941 года. Кадран Солер на Меньшиковом доме. Подняв волну, проходит пароход. О, есть ли что на свете мне знакомее, чем шпилей блеск и отблеск этих вод? Как щелочка чернеет переулок, садятся воробьи на провода, у наизусть затверженных прогулок соленый привкус тоже не беда. Courage. We know what now lies in the balance. What now is coming to pass, we know. The hour of courage has struck on our clock, and courage will never abandon us. We're not afraid to be shot dead, not bitter to be bereft of home. We will defend you, Russian speech, guard you, great Russian tongue. Free and unsullied, we will carry you through, save you from bondage for our children's children, forever. Мужество. Мы знаем, что ныне лежит на весах, и что совершается ныне. Час мужества пробил на наших часах, и мужество нас не покинет. Не страшно под пулями мертвыми лечь, не горько остаться без крова, и мы сохраним тебя, русская речь, великое русское слово. Свободным и чистым тебя пронесем, и внукам дадим, и от плена спасем навеки.
When I was born, my parents went to their family and friends and asked what they wanted me, the new child, to call them. My parents believed, both from their own experience and from reading they'd done, that whatever name a child's parents tell them to use for someone is the name that child will use for the rest of their lives. Most of my relatives picked pretty traditional names. My mother's parents chose Grandma and Grandpa. My mother's sister and her husband chose Aunt and Uncle. My father's mother, Beverly Reinitz, chose Graham, a shorter, snappier version of the classic. Neale Reinitz chose to be called Gaffer. And that's how I've known him for my whole life, Gaffer. Growing up, my parents always referred to him as Gaffer when talking with me, and it stuck. I was always excited for Christmas because Gaffer visited. I planned trips here to Colorado Springs to visit Gaffer. The phone number for 1928 North Nevada is still, to this day, listed in my phone as Gaffer, home. To me, Neale Reinitz will always be Gaffer. For those of you unfamiliar with the term, as I was until high school, calling an old man a gaffer is a primarily British colloquialism. A gaffer is the old guy on the block, tough, who's seen everything and is ready for anything. That was the name Neale chose, and it was a fitting one. Gaffer never said no to an adventure, and I remember how the summer I turned 15, when I was visiting him here in Colorado Springs, Gaffer went with me on a lantern tour of the Cave of the Winds. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the lantern tour, but it's the more intense one. You're carrying little bucket lanterns with candles, and you have to crouch and shimmy through a number of tiny cave passages. Gaffer was almost 85, and while he had to do some finagling to get through a couple spots, he got through the tour and afterwards told anyone who would listen how he had a fantastic time. Not only did he not want to disappoint me, his granddaughter, who wanted to go on a cave tour, but he also relished the adventure, the chance to do something exciting. I was so proud to have a grandfather like him. He brought the same energy and commitment to his intellectual pursuits. Gaffer was an avid reader of fiction, and throughout my time in high school, it seemed to me as though he had read every English novel in the world. He always asked what I was reading, both for school and for fun, and he had almost always read whatever it was. Gaffer was the most amazing person to talk to about books. Not only could he discourse at length on almost any piece of the English canon, but he also loved to recommend other books by the same or similar authors. I remember telling him that I had read and greatly enjoyed John O'Hara's Butterfield 8, and receiving an email from Gaffer a few days later telling me to look in the mail for what he, Gaffer, considered O'Hara's best novel. The book in question was called Appointment in Samara, and I highly recommend it to anyone who likes 1920s fiction. That was the kind of person Gaffer was, the kind who would send you a book not because it was your birthday or Christmas, just because he thought you would like it. Gaffer is the reason I fell in love with poetry. As I'm sure many of you know, he specialized in it and with a few drinks would recite verse after verse. His house was filled not only with nonfiction and novels, but also with books of poems. It was a chance encounter one day at 1928 North Nevada with a dusty volume of Emily Dickinson verse that first truly got me hooked on poetry. It is with this in mind that I'd like to introduce to you the poem I'll be reading. Gaffer loved Robert Browning and requested that the bishop orders his tomb at St. Praxis Church be read here today. As the poem was rather long, at Gaffer's suggestion and his instructions for this memoriam, I have chosen selections to share with you now. Vanity, saith the preacher, vanity, draw round my bed. Is Anselm keeping back? Nephews, sons mine, ah, God, I know not. Well, she, men, would have to be your mother once. Old Gandalf envied me, so fair she was. What's done is done, and I am bishop since, and as she died, so must we die ourselves, and thence ye may perceive the world's a dream. Life, how and what is it? As here I lie in this state chamber, dying by degrees, hours and long hours in the dead night, I ask, do I live? Am I dead? Peace, peace seems all. St. Praxis ever was the church for peace, and so about this tomb of mine. I fought with tooth and nail to save my niche, you know. Old Gandalf cozened me despite my care. Shrewd was that snatch from out the corner south he graced his carrion with, God curse the same. Yet still my niche is not so cramped, but thence one sees the pulpit o' the epistle side, and somewhat of the choir those silent seats, and up into the airy dome where live the angels, a sunbeam sure to lurk. And I shall fill my slab of basalt there, and neath my tabernacle take my rest. With those 9 columns round me, 2 and 2, the odd one at my feet where Anselm stands, peach blossoms marble all, the rare, the ripe, as fresh poured red wine of a mighty pulse. Old Gandalf with his paltry onion stone, put me where I may look at him. True peach, rosy and flawless, how I earn the prize. Draw close, what conflagration of my church, what then, so much was saved if aught were missed. Nay, boys, ye love me, all of Jasper then. 'Tis Jasper ye stand pledged to, lest I grieve, my bath must needs be left behind, alas. 1 block, pure green as a pistachio nut, there's plenty Jasper somewhere in the world, and I have knit St. Prax's ear to pray, horses for ye and brown Greek manuscripts, and mistresses with smooth great marbly limbs. That's if ye carve my epitaph aright. Choice Latin, picked phrase, Tully's every word. No gaudy wear like Gandalf's second line. Tully, my master's Ulpian, serves his need. And then how I shall lie through centuries and hear the blessed mutter of the Mass and see God made and eaten all day long and feel the steady candle flame and taste good, strong, thick, stupefying incense smoke. For as I lie here, hours of the dead night, dying in state and by such slow degrees, I fold my arms as if they clasped a crook and stretch my feet forth straight as a stone can point, and let the bedclothes for a mort cloth drop into great laps and folds of sculptor's work. And as yon tapers dwindle and strange thoughts grow, with a certain humming in my ears about the life before I lived this life, and this life too, popes, cardinals, and priests, St. Praxedit, his Sermon on the Mount, your tall, pale mother with her talking eyes, and newfound agate urns as fresh as day, and marble's language, Latin, pure, discreet. Well, go, I bless thee, fewer tapers there, but in a row, and going, turn your backs, I, like departing altar ministrants, and leave me in my church, the church for peace, that I may watch at leisure if he leers old Gandalf at me from his onion stone, and still he envied me, so fair she was.
Neale Reinitz was an extraordinary individual. Indeed, as Rick Bradley wrote to me in an email a couple of weeks ago, he was a figure larger than life. And as my father, that's how he always seemed to me, larger than life. In the trivial physical sense, he was 6 feet tall. I never got past 5'10". As a human being, as an intellect, as a hiker, even as a drinker, larger than life. Neale had a brilliant and unusual sense of humor. Many, many years ago, he organized a Marx Brothers Festival at Colorado College. And as a specially targeted act of nepotism, he arranged for me to be on the organizing committee. And he planned in a very Marxian way, we invited Richard Ennobile and Roger Ebert to come to this film festival and participate in panel discussions about the important cultural contributions of the Marx Brothers. Neale also arranged in a rather Grouchonian way that each of these panel discussions would be interrupted in a different manner by a Groucho figure running past, by the lights going down in the middle, so that these discussions did not interrupt the important part of the festival, which was watching movies like Horse Feathers. And so as Neale took a Grouchonian perspective on this festival, I can tell you that Roger Ebert played the part of Margaret Dumont. And I was present in the car with Neale when Roger Ebert took great offense
at the disrespect that we were showing to the seriousness of film, or as Neale liked to say in those days, the film, and left angrily. He left in a huff. Indeed, in the context I'm telling this story, I should say he left in a minute and a huff. Now, on a more serious note, I'd like to say some things about what I will miss most about Neale, who I always called Fav. We never spelled it the same way. I will miss most of all, besides talking and drinking, I will miss our many, many trips to the mountains. We went up all kinds of mountains all over Colorado. We backpacked. We did all sorts of things. And very closely tied to this is what I owe Neale. And this is something that many, many speakers today have brought up. I owe Neale Reinitz my intellectual formation. Everything that I know about the world outside of science, history, politics, literature, everything, I first learned from Neale Reinitz before I learned it in school or read it in a book. And what does this have to do with the mountains? Well, the most important part and the advanced part of this free-form course from my father took place on the downhill parts of hikes all over Colorado. I learned about the history of literature. That was where I first learned about Giraldus Cambrensis' great 12th century travelogue of Wales. The history of literature divided into chunks by mountain and by hike. I learned about how parliamentary rule was established in England. I learned about the political history of the United States, more things than I can even say in this talk. I owe a lot to Neale Reinitz. Now, this is a sad day because Neale Reinitz's body is dead. And I know this is true because I was there with him. And yet, I tell you that Neale Reinitz is alive. And he is with us right now. Because he lives in our hearts and our minds, and not only in our hearts and minds, but in the hearts and minds of everyone that we interact with and influence through the great unbroken chain of being that connects all human beings through history. Now, you may be saying to yourself, this is the kind of boilerplate people bring up at memorial services. But it's much more than that. Look around you. I thank Joe, I thank Linda, I thank all the speakers involved in this service. But Joe and I did not organize this service. Neale Reinitz organized it. We are just following his instructions. He is with us today, and he is still alive to us. And not only to us. As Jesus commented to the Sadducees in Luke chapter 20, verse 38, he is not the God of the dead, but of the living. And for him, all are alive. Thank you very much. We will now sing the Colorado College hymn, O God, our help in ages past.
rise, please? Let us go now, mindful of the mountains, living and loving while we may, finding truth and beauty in all that we sense, accepting vanities with a sense of humor. Let us go now, and may the God of the living be with us all. Amen.